on Auschwitz. The history of Auschwitz is exceptionally complex. It combined two functions, a concentration camp and extermination center. Nazi Germany persecuted various groups of people there, and the camp complex was continually expanded and transformed. In the podcast on Auschwitz, we discuss the details of the history of the camp, as well as our contemporary memory of this important and special place. The history of the Auschwitz camp contains instances in which prisoners attempted to resist. The most famous case is the revolt in the Sonderkommando that took place at Auschwitz II-Birkenau on 7 October 1944. This story is told in details in episode 21 of our podcast. However, there were other instances of prisoners organizing resistance to attack the SS or to escape. Dr. Piotr Setkiewicz, the head of the research center of the museum, talks about the details of different cases of revolts, mutinies, and mass escapes from Auschwitz. The post-war literature on Auschwitz, particularly in the 1960s, contained information regarding the occurrence of mutinies in the camp. What sparked the interest in this subject of mutinies at the time?
O buntach w Auschwitz mówiono już znacznie wcześniej, czy to w pierwszych powojennych relacjach więźniów, czy też w trakcie procesów SS-manów, które odbywały się.
The mutinies at Auschwitz have been previously mentioned either in the initial post-war prisoners' accounts or during the trials of SS-men in Poland in the late 1940s. Some presume it was born out of a desire to emphasize the resistance put up by the prisoners and reaction to the accusations or doubts of the public that the prisoners of Auschwitz died without resisting. Several countries, including Israel and Poland, levied such convictions and accusations against prisoners, highlighting this very motive of resistance. Even though the initial focus was on the suffering of the prisoners, which spoke of a prison community of suffering. Although this was the case during the early years, the role of resistance gradually began to fade away by the late 1940s and early 1950s, possibly due to two primary reasons. Firstly, Józef Cyrankiewicz became Prime Minister of the Polish government. He was a man of exceptional merit as a leader of the left-wing fraction of the Auschwitz resistance movement. Secondly, the emphasis on prisoner resistance enabled the party ideologists of the time to rationalize the actual motives behind the deportation of prisoners to Auschwitz. Strictly speaking, the reason for this straightforward interpretation was to act in the resistant movement and oppose the occupying forces. Additionally, the tendency to describe the reality of Auschwitz persisted into the latter half of the 1940s. However, as life in Poland stabilized, the topic became practically overlooked. The attention was directed towards accomplishments in building genuine socialism in Poland. However, in the mid-1950s, during the subsequent shift in our nation's history, the communist authorities at the time realized that Auschwitz and its symbolism could serve several purposes, notably propaganda. Consequently, the museum received some funds that enabled the commencement of scientific research, which had been scarcely undertaken previously. Although the guidelines in the museum's statute regarding the direction of the research, including highlighting the prisoners' struggle against the SS, none of the young Jagiellonian University graduates employed then by the museum were assigned to work on the topic during the first few years, which perhaps was the entirely pragmatic decision by the then management of the museum led by director Kazimierz Smoleń. He probably meant that the primary focus should be on investigating the basic facts of the camp's history and establishing a chronology of events. Furthermore, until the first half of the 1960s, little emphasis was given to the topic of the resistant movement. The situation changed with the mounting pressure on various cultural institutions in Poland, including the museum. And this was the result of a struggle within the Communist Party. It primarily concerned the efforts of people associated with Mieczysław Moczar, the so-called partisan circle. They contended that the research should emphasize the theme of struggle and resistance. And not only that, as it has so far been of communist provenance, but also of the partisan and resistant movement of the Home Army. the action undertaken was an apparent attempt to seize power in Poland with the aid of patriotic propaganda intended to demonstrate the universality of the resistance movement in Poland. As a result, a second scientific department, the Resistance Department, was founded at the Auschwitz Museum in 1965. Surprisingly, this actually took the matter of the resistance out of the focus of the actual research department. And these were the very issues that the second department was supposed to deal with. However, it soon became apparent that sources had to be gathered to undertake scientific research on the subject, that is, accounts from people involved in the resistance movement. And it took the two historians employed by the department quite a long time to do so. Subsequently, upon releasing the findings of their research in the early 1970s, amid the altered political climate, no signs of external influence on the content of these works can be traced, and their technical soundness and reliance on the sources available at the time remain intact to this day. To highlight the extent of the new resistance movement and its tangible results, it was indeed necessary to stress the activities involved in establishing mutual contacts with resistance organizations outside the camp and so on and so forth. All sorts of activities and self-help, but it was perhaps also expected at the time to highlight certain forms of active struggle against the SS that had occurred during clashes between prisoners and SS guards. Several such examples were found there. The most significant incident among them was the Sonderkommando uprising in October 1944, where the use of the term uprising instead of revolt underscores the exceptional nature of this event. In other words, we were dealing with a situation where the prisoners had a preconceived plan. They had a management structure in their resistance group, and their intentions went beyond a simple desire to save lives. That is, members of the Sonderkommando had gathered several primitive grenades. They intended to use them to blow up or burn the crematoria to stop extermination in the gas chambers. Finally, they intended, and indeed made it a reality, to cut the wires to the camp to allow other prisoners to escape. It is also for this reason that when speaking of clashes or mutinies in the camp, the story of the Sonderkommando uprising holds a significant position here, which is probably why many historians employ the term uprising and not just mutiny when describing these events. Regarding other revolts, the problem is that only the accounts of survivors describing such events were available for many years. Sometimes these accounts were only based on some rumors heard in the camp, which were inaccurate because most participants were killed, thus presenting a predicament. How then could the camp prisoners have known about such events? So yes, this knowledge was passed from mouth to mouth. However, it is usually somewhat distorted in such situations. Well, there was also the problem of the extent to which witnesses to these events, observers, could see exactly what had happened and know the backstory to the prisoners' resistance. So we here today are trying to re-verify all these incidents to establish the details based on the other witnesses' accounts and Nazi documents, which are mainly helpful to confirm that such an event took place firstly, and secondly to establish specific details, that is, the number of prisoners involved in a particular event, and above all, the chronology of events.
Ustalić szczegóły na podstawie innych relacji świadków oraz dokumentów nazistowskich, które w dużej mierze są pomocne do, po pierwsze, potwierdzenia, że takie zdarzenie miało miejsce, po drugie, ustalenia pewnych szczegółów, czyli liczby więźniów biorących udział w danym zdarzeniu, no i przede wszystkim chronologii.
So what distinguishing criteria indicate an event was a rebellion?
Mam tutaj na myśli przede wszystkim podjęcie realnych działań, które albo przejawiały się w bezpośrednim ataku na SS-manów, czyli podjęciu walki, tudzież w masowości zdarzenia, czyli musiało tutaj dojść.
By this I mean first and foremost, taking real action, which either manifested in a direct attack on the SS, so putting a fight, or in mass meeting or incident. That is to say, there must have been a situation where a particular group of prisoners, having had a preconceived plan, attempted to carry out the plan or an escape plan, but generally speaking, these were escape plan attempts. Another important distinction is how the SS formulated their description of these events, with very common phrases such as mutiny, revolt, and mass escape. I'm not referring to individual incidents, but joint group actions, such as attacking a capo or SS-man. Throughout Auschwitz history, there have been a few recorded incidents of confrontations between prisoners and the SS garrison members. It's worth noting that there may have been others that we do not know about, but there is some evidence to support these events, even if the sources are not entirely reliable. The problem, of course, is that these clashes usually ended in the death of all those involved, making it challenging to find credible witnesses. However, with regard to some incidents, we have a significant number of observer accounts, and we often encounter references in SS documents. Apparently, one of the earliest documented occurrences of this kind occurred on 26 June 1941, when the camp commandant commended Ewald Leonov of the 4th Guard Company of the SS for his perceptiveness, caution and conduct, which led to the prevention of a large-scale escape of Jews. In fact, we only have one such note and a few testimonies from prisoners who confirmed that during this period there were escapes of prisoners from the Penal Company, the Jews, and this is due to the specific situation of this group of prisoners, because at that time the Jews were all sent to the Penal Company immediately upon arrival in the camp and were murdered immediately by the capos there, and the average life expectancy, according to somewhat later documents, was approximately 15 days. In such a situation, these Jews understood that their efforts to work efficiently and meet the expectation of the SS men were futile, since they would still be executed. Here, we are probably dealing with the first such group escape of prisoners when the Jews of the Penal Company realized that earlier individual escapes had failed. The Guard simply executed these escapees. Therefore, they concluded that it might be possible for a group of prisoners to escape simultaneously to save at least some of the lives. Hence, the mention of a mass escape for the first time in German documents. And as it seems the entry in the bunker book of that particular day should also be linked to this incident. One of the Jewish inmates was taken into custody in a bunker in the basement of Block 11. It is all the more intriguing because being sent to the Penal Company was the harshest punishments for Jewish prisoners then. So if a Jew ended up in a bunker in the underground cells of Block 11, it signified some extraordinary event. So one may construe that the Jewish prisoner was possibly involved in the escape or had information about it, resulting in his confinement and interrogation by the political department. But it was likely for procedural reasons, as the interrogation didn't yield much. We know from another document that this Jew was released from the bunker on June 30th, but died on the same day in the camp. If he was released, he must have been sent to the Penal Company, killed, beaten by a capo, or shot at the death wall. The second such event, which had a greater impact on the prisoners, was the escape of Polish inmates from Birkenau's Penal Company on 10th of June 1942. And it was an incident widely discussed in the camp. Not only did the prisoners of this camp know about what had happened at Birkenau, but news of it reached the main camp. We have several witnesses' accounts, but their credibility varies from obvious reasons, except those who survived the Penal Company and witnessed the tragedy unfold. Moreover, there were prisoners situated relatively close to the Penal Company's block, such as those in the camp infirmary or kitchen directly across from Block 1, which was the location of the Penal Company's headquarters at the time. We have many accounts from other prisoners who recalled or heard something. However, there is a considerable discrepancy in reliability regarding the details. Nevertheless, we have acquired new documents and sources in recent years, which have helped us to refine our knowledge of the subject. What actually happened in Birkenau's Penal Company in June 1942? Well, we know that at the end of May, a selection was conducted in the main camp, following which some prisoners from the Krakow transport were executed, and the rest, a considerable group of political prisoners, were transferred to the Penal Company in Birkenau, not knowing why the SS had done so. Upon speculating about their intentions, they surmised the aim was to dispose of or kill Polish prisoners no longer required for Gestapo investigations. With this concern, they ended up in the Penal Company, more so as it turned out on site that they had been additionally branded with the so-called red marks. All prisoners in the Penal Company had such patches on their striped uniforms in the form of black circles. On the other hand, the group of Poles who were transferred to Birkenau at the time received additional red points indicating that they were somehow particularly dangerous. So it was the first alarm bell for those prisoners. The second, as they stated, was summoning certain groups of prisoners back to Auschwitz. The alleged purpose was for interrogation, though in reality they found that the prisoners were being killed and executed at the death wall. They also concluded that the purpose of transferring this group of Polish prisoners to the Penal Company was to either expedite their death through arduous labor or conversely have them gradually transferred to the main camp and shot in small groups. Consequently, a faction of these prisoners devised a plan to execute a mass group escape from the worksite, specifically from the excavation of the Königsgraben drainage ditch located between the Birkenau camp and the Vistula River, and this plan was successfully executed on 10th of June. It consisted on one hand of attacking the SS guards, but in such a way that they were not killed, which should be emphasized because in my opinion it indicated that these prisoners, the initiators of the escape, were also thoughtful of the fate of those who would remain in the camp. The attack was therefore only intended to incapacitate the SS men, to take away their weapons with no intention of killing them. Then, the group of prisoners were supposed to make a run for the bushes by the Vistula River, swim across, and then continue on their own in search of rescue. They hoped above all that the other prisoners who were not privy to the plans of this group, upon seeing what was happening, would spontaneously join the escapees, which was evidently a flaw in the plan. As one would expect from today's perspective, it turned out that most prisoners from the Penal Company were surprised by these events. They didn't know how to react and what was really happening. Conversely, the escape initiators were also left with no alternative. They could not inform all their colleagues of the planned escape, as there was a considerable risk that one of them might betray the plan. The escape also occurred on the afternoon of 10th of June, when, upon the signal of Kommandoführer Moll indicated the end of the workday, the prisoners sprang into action but encountered a problem at the outset. Well, it started to rain heavily that day, and Kommandoführer Moll decided to finish work early. According to the camp's regulations, prisoners were required to work until 6 p.m. Nevertheless, considering that one of the escapees was killed at 4 p.m., it is conceivable that the work had to be finished 2 hours earlier. This also caused confusion among the prisoners, and they didn't quite know what the whistle meant and why it sounded much earlier than usual. Notwithstanding, ultimately several prisoners threw themselves into flight, toppling a few SS men to the ground. Presumably, the SS men were very surprised by what had happened. Firstly, their freedom of movement was scarcely restricted as they were stuck in the field around the Königsgraben, cladded in the so-called military raincoats. It is presumed that their proximity to the laboring prisoners impeded their reaction time in loading a cartridge into the chamber and firing. Furthermore, they only started to tack on their rifles and attempt to shoot as these prisoners passed them. Several prisoners managed to escape into the open. However, once bullets started whizzing around them, some stopped. Moreover, the several capos guarding the commando reacted faster than the SS men. As was customary, they had sticks at their disposal, which prevented a group of prisoners from escaping. These events are also corroborated in the witnesses' accounts, with minor differences, and in the accounts of the SS men. Obviously, the most important witnesses were those prisoners who escaped. German documents indicate that 9 prisoners escaped from the camp. However, more recent material show that only 3 or 4 prisoners escaped Auschwitz, as the others were captured shortly afterwards. One of them, or the body of one of them, was fished out a few days later from the Vistula or the old Vistula riverbed near the camp. 2 other prisoners were later captured, one of them in Tarnów. He was to be taken to Auschwitz, where he presumably died. Another was shot and killed while attempting to flee from his captors at an unspecified location. Practically speaking, only 3 or 4 prisoners successfully escaped from the camp. Let us now look at one of the most significant and tragic moments in the story of this escape, namely the investigation by the SS men to uncover what truly happened and who initiated the escape. The witnesses' accounts differ considerably because some previously marked with black dots were removed from the Penal Company to work on 11th of June, leaving only prisoners marked with the red dots on the side. Furthermore, hardly anyone was there to witness what actually happened. Perhaps a few prisoners may have been part of the block staff, and these were witnesses, prisoners who were nowhere nearby, such as the camp kitchen staff. These accounts also show that many prisoners, as many as a dozen, 20 or even dozens, were shot during the investigation conducted by Auschwitz-Lagerführer Aumeier and several other SS men from the political department, the Gestapo in the camp. He arrived at the field from the Penal Company block on the morning of 11 of June and tried to extract confessions from the prisoners. Despite his efforts, the prisoners refused to give the names of the mutiny organizers, prompting him or his comrades to execute them one after another with a gunshot. After that, he threatened that if nobody opted to betray the escape organizers by the time he returned later that afternoon, all the prisoners would be executed in the same manner. We know from witnesses' accounts that in the afternoon, all the prisoners from the Penal Company, marked with red points, were gathered in the courtyard of the block. They were told to undress, which probably meant simply taking off their striped jackets. They tied their hands with wire or barbed wire and led them away in unknown direction. According to most authors of accounts, these prisoners were murdered in the gas chamber. This was most likely the only gas chamber in existence at the time in the so-called Bunker 1 at Birkenau. Some admittedly recollect that these prisoners were shot because the moment they left the camp and marched out in a column guarded by SS men was the last time the prisoners laid eyes on them. However, the decisive testimony here seems to be the one of the head of the political department, Maximilian Grabner, who confirmed that these prisoners were murdered in the gas chamber. This escape has several intriguing aspects, including who made the decision to kill the remaining prisoners, given that it was an event with a unique story. Ordering the murder of a large group of Polish political prisoners in the gas chamber. As it appears, the sequence of events was as follows. At dawn on 11 of June, when reports of the pursuit outcome reached Rudolf Höss, the camp commandant, he became somewhat agitated because an escape, particularly a group escape within the camp, could impact a critical assessment of his performance. The death of several hundred prisoners in the camp, either by gunshot or in the gas chambers, is no reason for the SS Main Office for Economic Administration or the SS authorities in Berlin to reprimand the camp commandant. However, one such reason is permitting a group of prisoners to escape from the camp following some revolt. And this is precisely what happened, as Höss' irritation may have resulted from the first report, the content of which we do not know. All we know is that such a report reached Berlin on 11 of June, and Höss, seemingly aware beforehand, suggested extremely harsh measures to demonstrate his resolve, specifically the execution of the remaining prisoners from the Penal Company marked with red dots. It appears that he executed this act after Aumeier's morning investigation, during which no one was willing to denounce the instigators of the revolt. Presumably, Höss' decision or support to this proposal came on the same day, as he ordered the execution of these prisoners in the afternoon, not on his own accord, but with Berlin's authorization. We also know that Höss submitted another report on the incidents in the Penal Company 2 days later, so the Berlin authorities must also have been very interested in what happened at Auschwitz. Later, he was also ordered to submit a very extensive report on what measures the camp had at its disposal in the event of a repeat of such situation, that is, an attempted mass escape. Höss provided an extensive explanation, as evidenced by the preserved document, that he has at his disposal a rescue platoon comprising of non-commissioned officers and 35 armed privates ready to be deployed to the location immediately. In addition, he also has an alert unit at his disposal, a company consisting of soldiers who theoretically are off duty and perhaps within the barracks, but in a state of semi-readiness, which implies that they certainly cannot, for instance, obtain military passes during this time, resulting in a slightly longer time requirement to assemble them all. At the time, such a unit comprised 170 to 200 SS men who could be deployed into action in half an hour. Finally, Höss hinted that there was also a squadron of planes available at the Katowice airport, which seemed a little strange, as these were reconnaissance planes that would be useful for search operation in open terrain. It is evident that the interest in this escape on the part of the authorities in Berlin was not something that Höss expected or something that excited him, given that he didn't reward any of the SS men who took part in the pursuit with either praise or some sort of a reward, such as additional leave, for example, indicating that he'd rather the incident was not remembered in the camp. Based on these documents, we can also estimate how many prisoners died during the investigation in Block 1 and how many were murdered in the gas chamber. Through an analysis of entries in the daily log, it can be deduced that the SS also tried to conceal the fact that so many prisoners died on one day and therefore entered 50 at a time for several consecutive days. The camp clerks occasionally attempted to simplify their tasks by compiling a comprehensive list of the prisoners who were murdered on 11 June and entering 50 names day after day. However, their surnames were bracketed to prevent confusion in the grouping of prisoners. Therefore, it can be established that roughly 250 prisoners died, including those executed in the courtyard of Block 1 and the vast majority who lost their lives in the gas chamber. In other words, the prisoner's testimony of 330 deaths may have been an approximation since it was practically impossible to count accurately. Still, their estimation of the actual number of deaths was more or less accurate.
Jak i oczywiście znacząca większość to ci, którzy zginęli w komorze gazowej. Czyli nie tak jak więźniowie zeznawali około 300, tam 330, oni sami tego zresztą dokładnie pewnie nie mogli policzyć, bo nie mieli ku temu jakiejś praktycznej możliwości, ale mniej więcej oszacowali, jak się okazuje, liczbę zamordowanych prawidłowo.
While the June 1942 revolt of the Penal Company was the first known incident, were there other similar events that the camp authorities tried to conceal?
To, jak wspomniałem, stanowiło pewien kłopot każdorazowo tego typu zdarzenie dla dowództwa garnizonu Auschwitz. I widać to chociażby na dwóch kolejnych przykładach takich zdarzeń, takich buntów, które miały miejsce w 1942 roku.
Certainly, as I mentioned earlier, such events presented a challenge for the Auschwitz garrison command each time, as evidenced by the following two examples of revolts that occurred in 1942. The first was an event described in the literature as the Budy Revolt. This is an exceptional event in the history of Auschwitz, given that the only information available on the matter for many years came from the accounts of 3 SS men. Other than their testimonies, there were no additional witness accounts, as it was presumed that no one had survived. The individuals involved including Commandant Höss, Perry Broat, a Gestapo camp officer, and Maximilian Grabner, who testified about it during his trial in Krakow. According to the SS men, incident unfolded during that period with the Women's Penal Company in Budy, which they characterized as a revolt or a mutiny, and 2 of them were undecided if this was an act of desperation on the part of the female prisoners or provocation by either the SS officers or the functionaries then in the Penal Company. Despite repeated analysis by historians, there is little consensus on these accounts except for the indication of a possible mutiny in the Women's Penal Company. Then the focus shifted to a massacre without any indication of an action instigated by the female prisoners. In recent years, additional documents and materials have become available, allowing us to improve our knowledge of the events that transpired in Budy. Firstly, we can infer that the event occurred about a month earlier than previously assumed based on a single account by female prisoners at the Birkenau camp, which seems inaccurate. We know this because there are references to exchanges of correspondence between Commandant Höss and the authorities in Berlin. Following an initial telegram, a detailed report was later requested from Höss to be presented to the SS Reichsführer on September 10 regarding the incident in the Penal Company in Budy. That is one consideration. 2, there's the testimony of a female prisoner in the Block 11 bunker with the German functionaries involved in these incidents. She also mentioned that the incident occurred around this time, somewhere in the first half of September. Secondly, we certainly know that the SS witnesses' suggestion that the Jewish women from France were not killed in a mass execution was a ploy to eliminate witnesses to the close relationships between the German functionaries and the SS guards in Budy. This is absurd and even unconvincing for many reasons. Secondly, we certainly know that the SS witnesses' suggestion that the Jewish women from France were killed in a mass execution as a ploy to eliminate witnesses to the close relationship between the German functionaries and the SS guards in Budy is not true. This is absurd and even unconvincing for many reasons. On the other hand, was it really the case, as mentioned in some of the accounts, that the Jewish female prisoners from France were planning some group escape and that this revolt had taken place? Well, it is also unlikely because all such group escapes from Auschwitz, or attempts to do so, took place in daylight, which was prudent as it made it much easier to execute. It was easier to escape from the work sites of a particular commando outside the range of the camp fence than from the camp itself. If the event had occurred during nighttime, the prisoners would have to consider the reaction of the functionaries. There were two primary issues to consider. Firstly, how to breach the camp fence without incurring too many casualties, and secondly, how to avoid being shot by the SS officers in the guard towers. It is doubtful that if such a massacre had taken place at night, it was due to the prisoners' desire to carry out an escape. The most likely reason for the massacre was an incident that occurred the day before. This is described by a prisoner from Yugoslavia who admittedly didn't witness the revolts in Budy, but arrived there relatively recently afterwards and spoke to a functionary who described quite extensively and reasonably what actually happened. Reflecting on this, one would first have to ask why a sizable group of what is described as 90 female prisoners there, Jewish women from France, were simultaneously transferred to the Penal Company in Budy. None of the historians have so far pondered over this question. It is evident that these prisoners had previously demonstrated opposition while incarcerated at Birkenau, where they presumably reject specific orders, and their conduct was considered unacceptable, resulting in their transfer to Budy as a punishment. That's one thing. Two, based on the prisoner's account, it is evident that the Jewish women from France who were forced to engage in grueling labor in Budy, involving cutting reeds and transporting materials in wheelbarrows over large expanses of land, were brutally treated by the German functionary prisoners and eventually began to resist. Eventually, one of them started shouting at these female functionary prisoners, refusing to do any more work or protesting against the beatings, and found support among her female colleagues. And there the German capo stood helpless. In this situation, they didn't know how to react. Typically, they would probably have expected an order from their Aufseher, a supervisor who was absent from Budy at the time. It posed some significant problems for German functionaries. What to do in such a situation, and what would happen if the situation recurred the next day? How can they enforce effective work on the other female prisoners of the Penal Company if the latter refuse to follow their orders? So, it must be assumed that these capos colluded in the evening to teach these prisoners a lesson. They armed themselves with sticks, some had tools, one had an axe with her, and they rushed into the rooms occupied by the female prisoners and started hitting them in the middle of the night. They began to abuse them. Not knowing what was happening, some prisoners began to resist as they saw an axe in the hands of one capo and assumed they would be murdered. Also, some of them started to resist, which further enraged the functionaries. Other French women tried to escape the building by jumping out of windows. However, they found themselves isolated in the courtyard by barbed wire fence. According to other accounts, the SS guards at the site hurled stones at them. Whether they opened fire remains a mystery, though it wasn't long before these functionaries caught up with female prisoners and nearly all were murdered. This was most likely the chronology of events. Here again, Höss supposedly tried to conceal what happened in Budy from his superiors. Theoretically, no one failed here, so there was no escape this time. Nevertheless, the fact that such a revolt, as Höss attempted to describe it in his report, took place could testify to the somewhat unfavorable conditions that prevailed in the camp and to the discipline among the female prisoners, for which the camp commandant was ultimately responsible. And in this case again, none of the SS men received any reward after the incident, after this massacre. The German functionaries also violated the regulations by not informing their superiors in such circumstances, initiating some official procedure as provided for in the regulations, that is, filling penalty reports and so on. They instead took matters into their own hands and murdered dozens of female prisoners. Therefore, they probably deemed it necessary to silence these German functionaries to conceal the incident. This was done by murdering them at the end of the investigation with phenol injections directly into their hearts.
Wzięły sprawę w swoje ręce i zamordowały kilkadziesiąt innych więźniarek. W związku z tym pewnie uznano, że lepiej na wszelki wypadek te funkcyjne Niemki uciszyć i uczyniono to w ten sposób, że zamordowano je po zakończeniu śledztwa zastrzykami fenolu wprost w serce.
How many of these functionary prisoners were there? Do we know how many functionary prisoners carried out this execution?
Wiemy jedynie, że 6 z nich zostało uznanych za winnych.
We only know that 6 of them were found guilty and later murdered with phenol injections. However, accounts of this female prisoner indicate that there were also several other female functionary prisoners on site. But it's difficult to determine the extent of their involvement in the murder of the French Jewish women. Perhaps some SS men were also involved, but no exact mention of this is in any document.
Być może również jacyś SS-mani też mieli w tym udział, ale tutaj w żadnym dokument o tym dokładnie nie wspomina.
Can we also categorize the escape of Soviet prisoners of war as mutiny?
Tak, jak najbardziej, bo spełnia ona taką przyjemną przez nas definicję, to znaczy doszło do opracowania wspólnego planu, była jakaś grupa kierownicza w gronie owych jeńców i plan ten przewidywał jednoczesne grupowe przedostanie się.
Yes, by all means, because it meets our adopted definition. That means a collaborative plan has been developed. A leadership faction emerged among the POWs, aiming to breach the fence, potentially engage the SS personnel, and ultimately find an opportunity for several in a subsequent escape. This account was recounted by multiple Soviet POWs incarcerated in Birkenau at the time. This is, I would say, in the late autumn of 1942, and this applies particularly to those who escaped successfully. On the contrary, there is virtually no trace in German documents of such an escape by Soviet prisoners of war. Only by reading some of the documents thoroughly can we realize how much of an impression this escape made on the Germans and the SS men, and how problematic it was for them, particularly for the garrison command. Well, the crux of the problem in discerning the events that took place at Birkenau during that time lies in the fact that there were no witnesses' account available for several years, primarily from Soviet prisoners of war and escapees. However, as it is the case with accounts from POWs or prisoners from the Soviet Union, they were significantly exaggerated after the war. I would put it this way. It was done to meet the listeners' expectations, and perhaps also to satisfy the expectations of censorship or other Soviet authorities. In any case, there are descriptions in a rather heroic tone, which is no bad thing. However, the assumption for many years that the escape occurred on 6 of November 1942 clearly indicates the ideological bias present in these accounts. After all, what could be more sublime than organizing an escape from Auschwitz on the anniversary of the October Revolution, right? These witnesses also mentioned that the escapees shouted "Hurrah!" right? Here, I would hesitate to confidently assert that it is impossible, as it may have been the case. What do we know for sure? We know that of the 10,000 Soviet prisoners of war brought to Auschwitz in 1941, only a small group of around 100 survived the massacres. These survivors incarcerated in Birkenau were remembered by other prisoners as sympathetic and trustworthy. They were recognized by the garrison command officers as veterans worthy of respect. They were the fortunate few who survived among the vast multitude of Soviet prisoners of war deported to Auschwitz. These Soviet POWs were occasionally utilized for search operation within the camp, which was quite prevalent and sometimes unrelated to an escape. However, if a prisoner goes missing while a commando unit is working in a fenced-off area, it may not always be related to an escape attempt. The prisoner could have collapsed out of exhaustion or died in a place where their corpse was difficult to locate. In such a situation, an SS alert unit was sent to search for corpses and a group of kapos or Soviet prisoners of war. And these POWs, knowing this, decided to exploit the procedure used by the SS men. They concealed the corpse of a prisoner who died of natural causes. When a search was authorized, they gathered in groups at the Birkenau site, where construction work was ongoing on the new section of the B2 sector of the camp, which was a colossal and extensive part of the Birkenau camp. Suddenly, they headed towards the area with an opening in the fence. there was a hole in the fence because that part of the camp had not been inhabited yet. Interestingly, at the time, Sector B2, the largest part of Birkenau, was still unoccupied and under construction. Although the construction office had informed the camp command that the fence surrounding Section B2 had been completed, an illicit gap still existed in the fence, possibly to facilitate the transport of construction materials. Additionally, the Sonderkommando prisoners assigned to the gas chambers of bunker number 1 utilized a similar slanted pathway through this section. This was also unofficially tolerated, and so the Soviet prisoners of war decided to exploit this loophole. They launched themselves there with a loud outcry in their dozens. It is difficult to determine the exact number, but it's plausible that 50-70 of them participated in the escape. They toppled the guard tower and dozens successfully escaped. We do not have specific figures because this escape resulted in the SS not reporting anything. The camp commandant presumably expected that the matter might somehow resolve itself, as the Russians were probably unfamiliar with the terrain and had problems establishing contact with the local Poles. Therefore, sooner or later, these fugitives would somehow be caught and the entire matter concealed from the authorities in Berlin. An interesting report from the camp resistance states that, first of all, it allows for the adaptation of this event on 28 October 1942. It quite appears to be reasonable and based on yet another source. Firstly, it was stressed in the report that this incident had stirred up panic among the garrison command, and they were doing their best to cover it up at all costs. We also know that the daily report on the state of the camp was considered a sacred duty by the camp bureaucracy. As with other camps, the Auschwitz camp had to make daily radio reports to Berlin on the number of prisoners currently in Auschwitz. In any case, for a fortnight or so, the figure given for the group of Soviet prisoners of war was inflated as if no one had escaped. Only after 2 weeks did the camp authorities concede that something had transpired with a group of Soviet prisoners in Auschwitz, bringing the number down to 150. That's the information we have regarding the matter, which helps to elucidate why we have minimal insight into other similar incidents, especially given that most witnesses were killed during these mutinies. Given that there is almost no trace in German documents on the subject. As an illustration, we have incidents from February 1943, such as the murder of a group of prisoners from the Waldkommando in Budy, one of the Auschwitz subcamps. The events' detail are only known through the limited testimony of a handful of witnesses who were not present at the site and didn't have a clear view. Some of these witnesses were only brought in afterwards to assist with transporting corpses from the Budy forest to the camp. No witnesses actually saw the events that took place in this commando. They also gave very different dates when this escape, mutiny or perhaps revolt supposedly took place. It was only after piecing together information from different German documents that we could finally establish a somewhat precise timeline for this incident. What came to light was that the Guard Battalion commander decided to commend 8 SS men during this period. It's interesting to note that these men were part of the 1st Guard Company and Staff Company. This entailed gathering all the SS personnel, extracting them from their camp offices in the hall, and transporting them via trucks to Budy to fortify the pursuit squad stationed there. It indicates that such commendation was given to these SS men 4 days after the incident. We also know that on the same day, 8 February, 18 prisoners' bodies were brought from Budy to the camp morgue. This is also rare, suggesting something unusual must have happened that day. We also know that an immediate midday assembly was announced on the same day at Birkenau, and all the commandos returned to the camp. It was an unusual occurrence that suggested the SS Guards' apprehension of a possible collective mutiny or revolt by the Birkenau prisoners. Furthermore, the events that took place in the Waldkommando in Budy remain unclear. What is certain is that the initial escape of 2 Roma prisoners was accomplished with success, albeit temporarily, as they were recaptured and sent back to the camp the following day. Conversely, it appears that the other prisoners from the Waldkommando, who were also subsequently shot to death, tried to capitalize on the opportunity to escape. However, all but the couple were captured and killed during these pursuit operations. Consequently, these events in Budy at the time would be obscure if not for these scarcely documented minor entries in German documents.
Zostali zamordowani, zastrzeleni, po prostu również usiłowali skorzystać z okazji i podjąć ucieczkę, jednak wszyscy poza kapą właściwie zostali oni schwytani i zabici w trakcie akcji pościgowej. Więc gdyby nie te drobne wpisy w kilku zaledwie dokumentach niemieckich, właściwie nie wiedzielibyśmy, co wówczas w Budach się zdarzyło.
In the camp's history, have any isolated incidents of spontaneous action or acts of despair resulted in harm to the SS garrison members?
Tak, i tutaj jest tym chyba największy problem, ponieważ zdarzenia takie miały najczęściej miejsce w obliczu bezpośredniego zagrożenia życia. Czyli tutaj mogło chodzić albo o jakiegoś więźnia, który był bity przez...
Yes, and this is perhaps the biggest problem here, as such incidents have often occurred in the face of an immediate threat of life. The context implies that the discussion revolves around a prisoner who was assaulted by an SS officer and attempted to retaliate in desperation. Alternatively, it could have and most definitely involved groups of Jewish prisoners. The individuals in question could be those selected during the camp hospital selections, or those who met their fate in the gas chambers after the selection at the Birkenau railway platform. Such testimonies also exist in this case, except that they are very vague. It is comprehensible that, as the authors are prisoners who may have observed the events from afar, they may have missed specific details. The resistant movement reports mentioned that certain Jewish prisoners groups exhibited fierce resistance. They refused to be escorted to the gas chamber. A fascinating sketch was discovered post-war on the former campgrounds, accurately depicting various events from camp life, most likely the work of a Jewish prisoner who served as a nurse at Birkenau Hospital. And he illustrated such a depiction. It is a group of prisoners, not so much prisoners as deportees to the camp, as they are yet to don civilian clothes, wielding arms and clearly engaging in a fight against the SS men. They try to snatch some rifles from the SS men. The SS men shoot them. From the background of the picture, it is evident that this incident occurred more or less on an outskirts of the B2 section of Birkenau. The area has quite a large meadow, so the only feasible explanation for what happened is the attempted resistance by the prisoners brought into the gas chamber, regardless of whether it was crematorium 4, 5, or any of the makeshift gas chambers referred to as houses or bunkers. But again, we do not know when this might have happened. Seeing, for example, on the horizon the smoking chimney of the chemical plant powerhouse of the Buda Werke factory in Oświęcim, one can more or less date this event as sometime in the summer or late spring of 1943. Very little is also known about the most renowned act of despair and resistance by individual prisoners which occurred in the changing room of one of the Birkenau crematoria. In this instance, a girl or young woman managed to take hold of a pistol belonging to SS-man Schillinger. She shot him in the basement of crematorium building and severely wounded his companion. This incident was recounted in numerous variations throughout the camp due to its culmination in the demise of an SS officer. And one such person was an SS-man infamous for his brutality in the camp. The narrative spread through the word of mouth. A woman showcased bravely and resistant, ultimately murdering an SS officer. Nevertheless, the delicate nuances were indiscernible due to the sheer volume of accounts and testimonies. As a result, certain details remained unverified and contradicted other witnesses' accounts. However, we have in our possession a document that came to our attention relatively recently, which confirms the account of a witness, likely the one closest to the incidents, namely Philipp Müller, a member of the Sonderkommando stationed in Birkenau. Müller reported that after the girl, a dancer, shot and severely wounded his colleague, the SS men in the undressing room next to the gas chamber fled, leaving their colleagues to their fate. The door to the undressing room was then closed and the lights turned off. The door remained shut for a prolonged duration until reinforcements arrived, and it was forced open. Despite the peril, a small group of SS officers cautiously entered the dark room, where they eventually located the bodies of two of their colleagues and dragged them out across the floor. From there, they managed to remove them from the undressing room, which their colleagues saw as the act of bravery. A document exists wherein the camp commandant requests medals be awarded to the SS men who acted heroically during the Jewish transport revolt, saving their colleagues from difficult circumstances. The names of the 2 SS men were listed in the application. This incident concerned the SS man who hauled the corpse of Schillinger, who was already dead, from the undressing room of the crematorium, along with that of his colleague, who was critically injured but survived. So, employing a confrontational approach, cross-referencing witnesses' accounts, and extensively consulting SS documents has enabled us to more accurately assess the events narrated in the camp's history and clarify their factual accuracy and chronological order.
Weryfikując relacje świadków, plus posiłkując się w znacznej mierze, w większym stopniu niż uprzednio dokumentami SS, jesteśmy w stanie zbliżyć się do oceny, jak przebiegały dane zdarzenia w dziejach obozu i uściślić ich faktografię, jak i chronologię.
In conclusion, it seems worth bearing in mind that the revolts or incidental cases of resistance were only a fragment of the entire story, and that most of the prisoners were fighting their own internal battles to survive. I think it is worth remembering that there is no opposition here. Simply put, some undertook such efforts. The others didn't pursue it because they were merely struggling to survive.
Ewidentnie, spoglądając z tej szerszej perspektywy na historię Auschwitz, można zauważyć, że dla wielu więźniów codzienna walka o przeżycie była
Yes, because looking at the history of Auschwitz from a broader perspective, one can see that for many prisoners, the daily struggle for survival was pretty much their resistance. In other words, considering that many uncertainties, they may have a reasonable cause to think that they, by behaving as such, they could stay alive. The war could have ended abruptly, and was the case over 20 years before, when Germany capitulated suddenly after the First World War. Several occurrences were plausible, such as a nationwide uprising of Poles as planned by the Home Army, or the Germans could have forfeited their willingness to fight, or an assassination attempt on Hitler, which nearly succeeded. So these people sought to act rationally, trying to survive another day, another week, another month. On the other hand, the prisoners who knew their lives were in jeopardy and that actions would seal their fate resorted to acts of resistance and direct confrontation against the SS men. This was a desperate but necessary course of action from their perspective. Despite knowing they could lose their lives or be shot, the participants still risked undertaking group escape attempts because they knew it was the only chance for at least some of them to save their lives.
Zdawali sobie sprawę, że część z nich zginie, że część z nich zostanie zastrzelonych, to i tak podejmowali takie ryzyko, wiedząc, że to jest jedyna szansa, żeby przynajmniej część z nich ocaliła życie.
All episodes of the On Auschwitz podcast are available at auschwitz.org/podcasts. We kindly ask you to support our mission and share our podcast in social media.